Dobré dopoledne.
Good morning, everyone.
Vážení a milí hosté. Já bych vás
Ladies and
velmi
gentlemen,
ráda přivítala jménem Institutu
it is a great
divadelního
honor
ústavu,
for
který, jak
me
bylo
to
řečeno,
welcome
je
you here
jedním
on
z
behalf of the Arts and
pořadatelů
Theatre
této
Institute,
konference
which
společně
is
s Ministerstvem
co-organizing this
kultury a za
conference
přispění
with
kanceláře
the Ministry of
Kreativní Evropa.
Culture and with the
A já
support
jenom
of
úvodem bych
Creative
řekla
Europe.
několik málo informací.
I have just a couple of housekeeping remarks to start with, and also some introductory remarks on the topic of the status of the artist. This topic has been present in strategic documents since the late 90s, but only in 2020 did we, as an organization funded by the Ministry of Culture, receive the task from the ministry to prepare first mapping documents on this. This was then further strengthened by the urgency of the pandemic. A meeting between representatives from cultural associations took place, and we prepared first documents, which we are now publishing on our webpage. In 2021 and 2022, we partnered the project, which was supported by the Technical Agency of the Czech Republic, professional artists, and COVID-19. In the framework of this project, we also did a number of studies, and their outcomes will be published soon. Two of our employees are also members of the work group under the European Council, focusing on the status of the artist, and their results will be published at the end of this year. We took the opportunity and invited some speakers who will be presenting what is happening in other European countries. A lot is happening right now, so you will only hear about a couple of examples because the topic of the status of the artist is being dealt with in any European country. Basically, we will have a speaker from Norway also, and this is thanks to the fact that we have a bilateral program called Post-COVID Adaptation Cultural Model, and it is partnered by Norway, by our partners who are here with us. Finally, I would like to thank everyone for coming.
Toto velmi závažné téma a už předávám slovo zpět Sašovi Michalidisovi.
I would like to give the floor back to our moderator, Sasha Michalidis. Thank you. This was Pavla Petrova.
Je ráno, je vidět, že ještě se všichni musíme rozproudit. Každý řečník
I think it's still early in the morning, so we need to warm up a little bit. Now, please applause for Milan Němeček, the Vice Minister for Culture.
Dobré dopoledne, dámy a pánové, milí hosté.
Good morning, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Czech Ministry of Culture. I am honored to welcome you here. Unfortunately, the Czech minister cannot be here in person because he had an urgent mission. You have now heard a short introduction from our moderator and from the director of the Arts and Theatre Institute, and we are very grateful to the Institute for organizing this conference. Now, a word on our behalf, on behalf of the Ministry of Culture. As you have already heard, the status of the artist was finally defined in the National Cultural Policy and in the National Recovery Plan.
To znamená vlastně jakoby ano, ne, z hlediska jakoby splněno, nesplněno. Toho Národního plánu obnovy je i legislativní výstup v podobě
in the National Recovery Plan is
legislativní úpravy statusu umělce
the aim
v České
to
republice.
anchor the status of the artist in Czech legislation.
Odvolávají na prostě česká specifika, ale
often, as was said, people tend to say that the Czech Republic is special,
vím, že prostě ta
is different.
samozřejmě z hlediska
Of course, there are specificities in the Czech legal environment.
Líto mých kolegů, kteří více jak 20 let, spíš 30 let prosazují
But I have
kariéru výkonných umělců, jako jsou tanečníci a tak podobně. Protože vždycky se stavujeme argumenty k tomu, že v Albánii to mají takto, v Makedonii to mají takto, všechny státy to mají a my to nemáme.
Often they say that this was already provided for in Macedonia, in other countries, but sometimes they have to face the Czech legislation and its specificities. The topic was launched during the pandemic. We in the ministry felt its implications. The sector of culture was fragile and vulnerable, but on the other hand,
a to, co já si uvědomuji jako největší problém, je
we had many expectations from a new law that would provide for this.
Od různých segmentů kultury.
We have heard expectations from different cultural industries. I already took part in a number of conferences on this topic, and I have heard the expectations from filmmakers, from musicians, from other sectors.
A jsou dost často jakoby široce rozkročena.
And often there is a vast array of expectations. I want to be realistic, but also optimistic at the same time, and I hope that we will be able to deliver on this. And that this conference will contribute to it. The most important thing for us at this point at the ministry is to find a definition of how to anchor the status of the art in legislation. Finally, I would just like to say that we appreciate the title of this conference, who involves female and male artists. Sometimes there are issues with how to express this in Czech, so I'm happy to see that this title is completely correct from the linguistic point of view. I am glad you are all here. Please do take part in the debate and contribute to our mission.
Starting with a splash, that's okay. Hi, I'm Anja Nylund-Hagen. Thanks for this invitation to be here today. I work in the Arts Council in Norway, and we are here basically because we have this bilateral project with the Arts and Theatre Institute, and we are going to do more research and more interesting work. But now I'm here to talk about what we have researched in Norway. My background is as a researcher in actually music and media studies. But now I work in this department where we do research to make a knowledge-based platform for policymaking, both for the Ministry of Culture, but also to keep relevant for the research fields. So who are the ones skipping the slides? You. Okay, Anna, you can skip. Last year, the Ministry of Culture commissioned the Arts Council and the Norwegian Film Institute to map and analyze consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic and try to consider some policy tools. And since I'm a researcher, I will talk more about the empirical part of this, the results. And I will both mainly talk about economic data, actually, because my colleagues who are economics did some new kinds of basic research within the Arts Council based on numbers, figures, and data that we can access, and also because these crisis support schemes were made by the Ministry of Culture, but handled by us in the Arts Council. So I will talk about the results of actually what what we can see and find and learn from these data. Because one key takeaway we have from the pandemic is that the cultural sector as an industry need to have systematic knowledge about themselves, which means also have the real numbers and results as arguments for policy making, and also for by being professional. One can say any industry that want to be taken seriously have to have results that can be proved in knowledge and research. Yeah, so skip. The project has provided several reports, and you can skip one more. And I will talk, basically, it's unfortunately mostly Norwegian, but it's called Returning with Strength. So the aim is that we're not going back to the normal, we are returning stronger. Yes, and can skip, please. So I start to present a few results based on the economy in the sector. And here we have different levels. We have the artist economy by individuals, very much often self-employed. But we also have companies that make a really important part of the industry because they employ and they run projects where the artists are key because they create the content. Skip, please. And here I just want to give one result, because this picture shows the national domestic project. This is the total value creation in the whole Norwegian industry. And the blue line you see during the years from 2015 to 2021 actually stays pretty stable. The purple line there is the cultural industries. You can see how hard they were hit by the pandemic. And this is by looking at the domestic project, the product. But as we also know, the domestic product consists of, can be distinguished because we have both companies and enterprises as part of this result. We have the public institutions in this, and we also have the individuals, the freelancers, and which are self-employed. So you can skip 2. One more. No, yeah, this one. Just because I'm not an economic, I have looked up by asking my colleagues about these terms, because the LLCs that's the name of the liability companies, limited liability companies, which in this case means the bigger companies, also the commercial ones. So in this figure, it's not the small do-it-yourself artists, it's not the self-employed companies. But the interesting part is that if we see again results among these big companies from 2018 to and the pandemic starts about here, you see the blue line decreases. They fell in income. But what's the purple line? That's the annual result, which means that even though they lost income, they actually had positive results. Their results increased, which is because the pandemic, when everything stopped, also expenses fell. So this is just to show that the biggest parties out there, they actually weren't hit that hard. So again, I have to remind you, this is not the small companies. This is not where the independent artists are working. These companies probably hire independent artists. So that is also one interesting takeaway. You can skip. Anna? Thank you. And then what happened in the bigger public institutions with big fundings and grants going on? Well, they also lost their income from ticket sales. Very much, actually. But results in the end haven't been that dramatic for them either. actually, the museums had increased annual results in 2020 compared to 2019. And the music and performing arts institutions also had positive results. So why is this? Well, this is also because they have this stable, big institution economy and also had extraordinary supports given to them at the same time as the shutdown and didn't create. But the important thing is also that these positive results had to be given back to make new productions later on. So they are not lost in personal profit, but it stays there. But it's also an indication that big companies and big institutions, they made it pretty okay. Skip, please. And one other interesting finding we had is actually about the employment numbers. And we talk about how artists disappeared. We were at least afraid of them. But what the statistics on employment statistics that were compiled by the Statistics Norway, it actually shows that the employee numbers also increased. More people are registered in the cultural industries and as artists. Here, these numbers both include those with companies and also independent, self-employed artists. So from 2019 to 2021, we see more people registered as artists, and that's interesting, I think, during the pandemic with the crisis. But what's important here is that there are changes within this bigger picture about what kinds of employees we find. It looks like more started these self-employment companies, and maybe more were also out of employment relationships to bigger companies. But this is worth following up. An example of statistics that we actually didn't have very well prepared at the beginning of the pandemics, but that the industry really needs to be a serious industry. Skip, please. And then this graph is a bit difficult to read, but this is an illustration of the support schemes, because there were made support schemes by the cultural sector. 48 billion Norwegian kroner, which means about 480 million euros, went to two schemes, the compensation scheme and the stimulus scheme. And they were designed to achieve different ends. The compensation scheme was given to compensate for loss. The stimulation scheme was given to stimulate for more activity in a period where things stopped. They were compensated to have the chance to run culture, to do cultural stuff. But when we see how they were designed, it's actually strongly skewed in the distribution. And guess what? It's also following the big and the small pattern. Because what this shows is the number of recipients. And if you see the purple top there are recipients that applied for the biggest amounts of money. They were those who got more than 1 million Norwegian kroner. And if you see this line, the total sum of money, those at the top who applied for the most got almost everything, which means that those who got smaller amounts of money, they had this part of the money, which is also very interesting because the structure, this is very different from cultural policy as it's run because it's industry driven. It follows the sizes of the companies, which means that those that could show back to results from last year that were good, they were also And they also had the support related to their last year result, which also means that those who are running with small economies also were given least. So in some sense, this support scheme absolutely did very much good things and saved a lot of companies, but at the same time, it's segmenting the gap between the big and the small. Very simplified though, which I have to do when I talk, because there are many matters here that nuances the picture. But it's an interesting finding, and it's also worth evaluating more after. Another interesting takeaway by looking at the results from our own support schemes is that 80% of the recipients were not known to the Arts Council before, which means that a lot of new applicants were into this because they were running arts. But it makes sense to some degree, because many of those who normally function in the market and don't need the grants, they suddenly were among those who were hit hard, because the market economy also stopped, as we saw in the first picture. Yeah, skip please. So it's manifestation of the existing differences in the sector between companies with high and low annual results, also between artist groups, and probably were differences segmented due to the allocation of the support schemes. Next, please. When we continue to look at artistic work during the pandemic, this is more the economy, how the pandemic struck on individual level among the artists. Skip, please. We asked questions: how has the time spent on artistic work changed? How has the income from artistic work changed from 2019 to 2020? And how are changes in the income distributed among different artist groups? Skip, please. And this was a survey sent to Norwegian membership organizations in the arts field, owners of sole proprietorships. The word sole proprietorships is the self-employed. It's the economic term. And also receivers of government grants for artists. And it's the survey who 2,000 persons answered. And this is also just to say that the importance of research, that the pandemic has showed that these types of service on the artist economy has to be run frequently, which also is a matter that the ministry agree with. So more funding to having these running service every year to make time series and everything. Skip. What we see is that, of course, the performative arts were those who said that they spent less time on producing artwork during the pandemic. And but a few also spent more time. In the music field, you see it's pretty equal, and quite a lot say they spent quite the same time, because depending on what you do and how you work, you can continue do some interesting work during the pandemic. Skip. This is too hard to read for you, too little, but it's just confirming how actors, dancers, and musicians, especially in the popular music field, again, because they are the ones operating in the market more than from grants, they were also hit the most. So those doing work on the stage obviously lost both most income. Next, yeah, 5. But interestingly, the all numbers flatten a bit when we add into income from other types of work, or artist-related work, which means, for instance, education or teaching or things like that. Skip. Yeah, you can also skip that one. Also, there are some interesting takeaways, like, for instance, that art education matters. And also those in the big cities were hit more hard than those out in the field. And also artists who received government grants from artists before the pandemic, they fared better during the pandemic because they have this more stable economy, which of course is key to have at least for a few years to know that they have their safe income. Skip, please. I think we also skip this one and just go to one point on this part. Because I just wanted to show some examples in the end. Anna, skip. Because there were things happening, things were maintained, but the interesting shift in activity that more people produced meant that we have this bottleneck effect, because suddenly people had made things but couldn't distribute it, which is also a very important thing, not just because it can make a problem after the pandemic, but it's a very important thing to know when you make policy, because production and distribution are tied together like this. So to be able to produce and distribute, there also something with the bigger economy part in this. And one skip, next I think also it's very interesting to see that these artist-driven initiatives that happened quite a lot all around also kind of make some interesting movements in the field. These are examples from the performing arts. But you see, for instance, like more local and regional initiatives were developed. Of course, the international initiatives were harder to maintain, but there's also a shift in geographical power somehow. More decentralized initiatives, more, and also many initiatives really artist-driven, running performances in the streets, in the nature, which also are actually important movements for innovation and creating new art. So there, you can say that these initiatives that make artists, even though they lost their income, have this drive to create and also innovate, is pretty core, because this is what drives artists. Is not necessarily the money. Yeah. So because I'm out of time now, I will say thanks a lot, and just to underscore that these ways of doing research systematically has shown that to be very important, and that are also the knowledge-made policy is something to continue. And that is at least a key takeaway from the report that we made. Yeah, thank you very much.
Anja, you still have a minute.
Oh, I still have a minute. Okay, I have several slides at least.
So
yeah, but
keep your clapping. We have a few more slides to go.
Okay, then we can skip to the next one more. Because what I really do research on is digitalization. That is actually my field. So what also we find very interesting, and I make that as a key point, several put their art on the internet during the pandemic, which might be good because you can achieve more viewers in this, but then you also add your art in an infrastructure owned by platforms, owned by others, and which also is. There are like many positive things about this dissemination online because art can reach very broad. But when everyone did this in the pandemic, everyone, one important thing is also that none earned anything from it, and also copyright was totally out of the question. So as a new initiative happening during the pandemic, and also the future, I would say, because everything will soon be digital in more ways, to think about combinations that create digital tools for distributing art, but also make sure that both platforms and content is regulated politically is the last point I would make then, because there are so many new initiatives that happened, but not all of them are tailored according to how politics are made for the arts field. Yeah. Okay.
Anja, thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you. My name is Zuzana Došeková. It's a pleasure to be here. I hope I'm not going to depress you very much. I work for the Ministry of Culture of the Slovak Republic, but also I'm a part of the OMC European work group, which is what I will be mainly talking about today. Yeah, next slide, please. So just to explain, the OMC stands for Open Method of Coordination, and it's a group of European experts under the umbrella of the Work Plan for Culture of the European Committee. There's a priority C called an ecosystem supporting artists, cultural and creative professionals, and a European content. And as part of this, the group was established to meet, share experiences, and what is most important, it has a mandate for preparing a report with recommendations with the subject status of the artist. So it was already mentioned today that the report should be finished in spring next year. So I hope that will be very inspiring. And the OMC group does a lot of work in subgroups. I'm the chair of subgroup 1, which concerns the status of the artist legislation. The whole OMC group discusses different things: the fairness process, the social benefits, artistic freedom. These are all the subjects being discussed. But what I'm going to talk about is status of the artist legislation in different European countries. Next, please. Okay, so subgroup 1 has members from only a selection of European countries, which is Belgium, Bulgaria, Spain, Croatia, Italy, Latvia, Lithuania, the other way around, Malta and Slovakia. So this is important to mention just because the things that we have discussed in the subgroup are not all encompassing. I cannot talk for all the European countries. So it's not representative, but it's illustrative of different approaches that different European countries choose to treat the status of the artist question. And status, as I've mentioned, means legal status because the word status is used in different ways. It can mean the social or economic status of artists, their working conditions. But what I'm going to talk about is just the legal status, which means some kind of legislative document that treats specifically artists. Yeah, so we have, in the subgroup, we have collected some detailed data, and I'm going to give you an overview of those. Next, please. Okay, the first question was, do you have a formal status of the artist's legislation? So in our group, Croatia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and Spain have a piece of legislation called something like the status of the artist. Then there are countries like Belgium that do not have a law called status of the artist, but that have some social or other benefits for artists. But from the point of legislation, they are maybe in the labor law or social benefits law. They are in a different legislative document, so not a specific dedicated status of the artist legislation. And then there are countries that do not have one, but are thinking or planning to have one. And Slovakia is one of those, but yeah, it's a long way. I will come back to that later in the presentation. Next, please. Okay, so the different treatments to the scope or definition of artist, who is eligible to be considered by law as an artist. Most common sectors are audiovisual, visual, music, literature, theater, and dance, which you might consider like the traditional definition of art. But then some countries also consider translation, journalism, architecture, design, entertainment and shows like the circus, cultural heritage, and traditional arts and crafts. So these could be included in some other definitions. And some countries also consider technical professions and researchers or managers. So while in some countries the definition is quite narrow, only considering like artists and creators themselves, other countries also include technical and other professions. Next slide, please. What are the means of recognition? How can you apply for the status of the artist? Either it's a membership in a professional association. Lithuania, Latvia, I think Estonia too, they have professional associations where you have to apply first and then you are recognized as an artist, and then the law can also recognize you as an artist. In some countries it's the administrative code. For example, Malta, it just comes from administrative data. So if you are, let's say, a freelancer and your tax code is that you are in the arts sector, or your occupation is artistic, then you are eligible for the status of the artist. And authority, that's a third way to do it. You apply to a commission, you submit some documents and proofs of your activities, and then you can be accepted or not. And of course, different means may be used for different groups of artists. Next slide, please. What are the criteria, right? This is a very important question because countries that are thinking about introducing a status of the artist, well, the most important question for the cultural professionals is, okay, what do I have to prove? How do I prove that I'm an artist? So type of activity, of course, it could be that you do literature, theater, visual arts, or the sector, like I said in Malta, it could be just a sector thing from administrative data. Relevant training and education. In some countries, to come under the status of the artist, you have to prove that you have a relevant, let's say, university or college education. Professional experience. This can be a problem like for new artists, young and emerging artists. So it is a condition or not in different states. Professional character of the activity. So in some countries you need to do art as your profession, meaning that it's not just occasional occupation, it's your full-time job and you do it as a working professional. And as the either main or only occupation in some cases. Of course, you probably need some like tax domicile, or you need to be tax registered in the state that is giving you the status of the artist. Some countries see your output quantity in the sense that maybe you have made 5 shows or artworks, that there is a quantitative criterion, or qualitative. This is very unusual in a way that it would be defined in the status of the artist. It's usually a committee maybe looks at the quality, but I think it's Lithuania that only gives the status of the artist to, like, let's say, the most distinguished artists. So there are rules like either a state organization has both your art, or you have represented the state abroad, or your work has been commissioned, but you have and maybe an international prize. So, but this is not very usual, again, to have specific criteria of quality in the law as such. Proven income from copyrighted work or financial criteria. Some countries, they have maybe a minimum threshold proving that you need to have made this much money from the arts, which is like a way of showing that it's really a professional thing. And of course, it's never just one of these, it's mostly a combination of criteria. Next slide, please. Okay, who decides if the status is granted? This is maybe not such an important question. It's just like which body administers it. So it's either the state or some arm's length body. And it's not necessarily the Ministry of Culture, it can be the Ministry of Finance or maybe of Economy. Next, please. Well, and the most important question is, what is the purpose of the status of the art? Why should I apply for a status as an artist? And it's usually one of these three, or maybe several of them: social benefits, tax or fiscal benefits, and other benefits. Social benefits, it's the most common benefit that comes with the status of the artist legislation. And it's either unemployment, pension, disability, health insurance, temporary social support in times of low or irregular income, social support in retirement. This again, I think it was Latvia. It's like it covers your medical or utility bills if you find yourself in hardship, and pension, and well, COVID support that can come under that too. Well, tax benefits you can imagine, but then other benefits can mean access to funding. Also, the benefits of having the status of the artist legislation are statistical reporting and representation of artists. This is something that is felt in countries that maybe have benefits, but not a law about the artists, and they feel sometimes that it would be better to have a specific law because it acknowledges the importance of artists in the society. So it's not just about the benefits, it's also about like recognition of you as an artist. Next, please. Okay, and the case of Slovakia, which is the second thing I'm going to talk about briefly. Slovakia doesn't have a status of the artist legislation. It has a register of artists and other professionals in culture. This is something that we came up with during COVID times because the Ministry of Culture suddenly found itself in a position where it wanted to give some targeted support for cultural workers, but we couldn't easily identify them. We didn't know who these people were, and that's why we started a register where artists and other professionals, which means also technicians, could register the name and then use it to apply for COVID support. But it was only used once so far. So we do have a register, but what is going to happen to it, how is it going to be used from now on, that is not yet totally clear. Also, Slovakia has a supplement for artists with limited length careers, and that means that if you're a dancer, a singer, or a wind player instrument working in a state institution, so in the National Theatre and the National Orchestra, then if you can no longer exercise your career due to physiological reasons, you can claim a monthly support, which is 50% of average national wage, until your normal retirement. And this is not a nice thing to have, but it only covers a very small group of people, because it's only the national and state and public institutions. So all in all, it's about 70 people, which is not very much. And yeah, and one other problem that it has, I mean, it looks nice that it's 50% of the national wage, because you can have another job. It's just that maybe you're a ballet dancer, you cannot professionally dance anymore, but you can find another job, do something else, I don't know, teach, and you can still get the supplement. Only what happens is that once you are given the supplement, it's the same amount of money every year. It doesn't, well, if it's a, I don't know, if it's a 500 euro, it will be 500 euro until you retire. And also, it does not count against your retirement pay. This is a problem, right? Because then you come into the real old age pension, and it will be calculated from what you earn beside. So then, you know, you can have a bad surprise about how low your real pension is. So the good things and the bad things about the supplement. And next slide, please. And yeah, now back to the status of the artist. Slovakia is working on 2 legislative documents. One is the law of professional artists and other professionals in culture. And the other one is something that's called a chamber of professional artists and other professionals. So the law at the moment is not a real status of the artist legislation because it doesn't have any benefits. It's just the definitions. So the first step is being taken to define artists and other workers in culture. And that should be a gateway for opening other laws and using the definitions as a reference point that some maybe benefits can be obtained. But first we need to define who the artists are. So that's the first step. This is not something that exists. It's still in a draft version. It's being worked on, but it's not a law that we actually have at the moment. And the chamber, well, once they are defined, the plan is to make a chamber of professional artists as a umbrella professional associations for all workers in culture. It should be run by the artists themselves. The membership is voluntary, but why do we need this, right? It should be a main representing body of the sector and a partner for discussions with the public authorities. What happens in Slovakia, we have a lot of professional associations in every sector, but they're usually quite small, and there's a lot of them in every field. So this chamber would be one big professional association that could be a voice for all workers in the creative industries. And it should administer the register, the existing one. It should collect data on the sector, do some research. Its other purposes should be education, for example, on copyright, taxes, the realities of business, networking, information, and optionally, it could give grants and awards to its members. And well, the funding of it should be a part of it should be the TV license fees that we have. 1% of that would go into the chamber, and then the rest would come from membership fees. So that's just the plan at the moment. Again, I cannot promise this will ever come true. It's something the Ministry of Culture is working on. So that's the situation in Slovakia. I thank you very much. And in conclusion, I would just like to say thank you to the organizers for the invitation, and it's for organizing this conference in such a lovely space. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to stay in this wonderful city and in this institute. The organizers, thank you very much. Well, my conference is about the status of the artists in Spain. 2018 was the year of the union of the sector to achieve an improvement in the tax and working conditions of artists, creators, and cultural workers. The status of the artist was born, culminating a long and complex process of vindication and work by sectoral organizations to put on the table the importance of culture in our society and the consideration that culture constitutes an economic activity that is carried out in compliance with laws that are not adapted to the reality and idiosyncrasy of the sector. The essentially temporary nature of the artistic act, the non-obtaining of immediate results in the creative process, the obtaining of the same beyond the direct scope of its creator, the dependence on success, and many other factors consubstantial to artistic activity were not included in our legislation. The indispensable starting point was the status of the artist. It was borne in mind that Spain is made up of 17 autonomous communities and 2 autonomous cities, with the competence in culture assumed by them. All of them, only 5 have a sectoral collective agreement between companies and artists, and there is no single collective agreement at the state level that sets minimum standards. From it, we collect the report of the subcommittee of the status of the artist created for this purpose in the Congress of Deputies, which was approved unanimously with 370 votes and was deployed in a total of 75 legislative proposals. It was not decided to create a single corpus that included everything that affects the artist, but instead it was decided to surgically modify those rules that affected the development of this activity. Starting with the quintessential labor law, Royal Decree 1475 of 1985, which for 36 years was regulated the special labor relationship of this artist, not the creator or the rest of the workers, with their employer. Under this mandate, some regulations were modified related to the leasing of the artists in periods of inactivity with little success in the sector. Tax reductions in case of copyright, tax reductions for artistic contracts, and the most important, the mandate to improve the Royal Decree of Artists to adapt it to the needs of the sector. And the pandemic appeared, and everything was paralyzed except the sector. If the first action of unity was signed with the status of the artist, the pandemic caused the constitution of a transversal working group of performing arts and music to work for the entire sector and go beyond the need for the correct regulation of the employment relationship and power thus deal with all matters that affected the system, not only labor relations. The 52 measures working group was constituted, in which we have attached the official document. 52 measures agreed by the entire sector, employers and unions, to highlight those essential and priority points that had to be implemented urgently after the stoppage of the pandemic. I have a copy here of the result of this group. From the working group, you can see, due to the requirement of compliance with the status of the artist, a new special employment relationship Royal Decree has already been approved, in which the following have been included as important novelties. The inclusion of technical and auxiliary personnel in this special relationship. Work is now being done so that there is equally in terms of social security to cover the intermittence of all workers affected by the temporary nature of the activity, not the fraudulent one when there is a structure behind it. The inclusion of certain artistic activities that were not expressly included, such as magic or flamenco, and that remained under legal uncertainty. If you are not in the list of the definition of the artist, for example, you are out of the system, of the grant system. For creating a dialogue table with the administration that continues to work on VAT, public sector contract law. In these last 2 points, European regulations are essential. The public contract for hiring artistic performance is not well regulated and represents an unbearable and inflexible burden and sometimes makes cultural activity impossible. Likewise, cultural VAT, which should be admonished at European level as a super-reduced VAT to promote cultural activity and as a clear declaration of principles on the importance of culture as a differential factor throughout Europe. At present, we continue at the work table employers, unions, and administration with labor, tax, education and training issues, and various regulations to achieve the full development of the status of the artist and the regulations that affect our activity. Recognizing the difficulty involved in achieving these legislative changes, especially those that affect the Treasury, and that not all the parties are always totally satisfied, it is intended to work to maintain the union, even when interests are opposite, for the good of the performing arts, of all the agents in the value chain, and ultimately of culture. The role of sectoral organizations, such as FAETEDA, is essential. The level of information, negotiation, and lobbying capacity that is obtained generates benefits for the sector far greater than the disadvantages, such as the loss of dialogue among members of the possible feeling that a particular measure is not perfect, since that the solutions are general. In the 21st century, it is necessary to promote the mindset that one can go farther together than alone. Although this requires concessions from all for the benefit of the common good. Now, the social climate for addressing work precarization, fairness, basic income in our country is good, it's constructive. We are all at a single working group from the entire sector, sharing information, debate, and trying to understand the position of the other to reach the most satisfactory agreements possible for all parties, and thus prevent the administration from finding a disunited and uncoordinated sector. About the definition of the artist that you can see in these articles, the first article of the Royal Decree of Artists about the scope of application say that this decree regulates the special work relationship of artists who carry out their activity in the performing, audiovisual and musical arts. Then talked about the special working relationship of artists who carry out their activity in the performing, audiovisual and musical arts, as well as people who carry out technical or auxiliary activities necessary for the development of said activity. This is a new in our law, because the technicians and other auxiliary activities were out of this royal decree. And it's important to the list of activities that remarks in this article. And we have to, in Catalonia, not in all Spain, an institute similar like an Arts Council, but without enough budget. And Conca is named Conca from Catalonia, in the excellent work that was carried out to define artists and creators and which people could be covered by the protective regulations of the status of the artist. Conca has already developed a census system for Catalan artists, a pioneer in the rest of the state, and which we hope will be the model for the rest of the autonomous communities. I have a new, from yesterday. Our Ministry of Culture announced that the tax income, the personal tax income for artists will pass from 15% to 7% for rents under 50,000 euros. And to pass the 15% rotation to 2% rotation for temporal contracts. Then there are two new great things to say here, because we are working a lot to get the status of the artistic. Thank you very much. And sorry for my English. I'm studying a lot.
Thank you very much.
Hello, good morning. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I have to be here because this is too high for me, as the stage is too high for me. So I'll be this side of the triptych here. Thank you. I was saying thank you very much for the invitation of being here, and I hope I'm seeing this have been really useful, and I hope we can use all the time to discuss and make more questions if you want. I think it could be an idea. So we have really a fresh new status of the cultural professional. It's not exactly a status of the artist, because, as you will see, it involves not only the artists, but also other cultural professionals. It was published in November in the official legal journal, but it got into force only on 1st of January. It has four main topics that have been regulated with this legislation. First, the registration as a cultural professional. The main goal for this registration is to know the sector. As we will see if we have time, we have plenty of time. I can talk a lot. As you can see, maybe this registration will not achieve that goal, but the main goals were to know the sector, but also by that statistics, draft the cultural policies. We also have labor agreement special rules for the artistic sector, and some service agreement special rules for the artistic sector. And finally, we have a special social protection scheme for freelancers. One thing I would like to tell you is that the sector was asking for this, of course, a long time ago. That's obvious. We had 2008 a little attempt, but the legislation was not well constructed and was never applicable. No one cared about it. It was there, but no one used it. And now it was exactly the pandemics, which was the event that gathered the sector and made this possible. It was, before the pandemics, we never thought that we could have this in 2022. And the other thing I would like to give you as a point of introduction is that this is the topics of the status, but there is a labor agreement-driven movement on the legislation, trying to put the cultural professions under labor agreements, and taking them out of the freelance world in order to give them a better social protection, because our system is constructed over this idea of employee has a full social protection, freelancer, you have to earn yourself because you are an independent worker, so you have to take care of yourself. It's changing now, but in the beginning was structured like this. So the legislation got into force in the 1st January 2022 in everything that concerned the registration, the labor agreement special rules, and the service agreement special rules. But the special regime for social protection, it's only effective after 1st October 22. So sorry, we are 10 days, 8 days of the start. So I don't have so much experience on this part of the status. Who are the cultural professionals? According to this legislation, the cultural professionals are authors, so the creatives, the performance, any kind of artistic performance, technicians and similars, and which we call in Portugal mediators, but producers, communication professionals, museum guides, so a kind of professions that make the bridge between the artistic field and the public. About the registration. Cultural registration, professional registration, which is called Registro dos Profissionais da Área da Cultura. I just put in Portuguese because now we have this acronym, so you can see when it's RPAC. It's optional. That's why, to make a serious statistic, it's not so perfect. But it's optional, it's for free, and it's very easy. It's an online registration. You just have to tell the system that you are a cultural professional. They confirm that you have a tax code, which are on a list of the cultural professionals, and the registration is done. But if you want to have the special social protection scheme under the status, you have to be registered. In that case, it's mandatory to be registered. About the labor agreement, special rules. So, as many of the countries I think that are represented here, a labor agreement is a contract in which the employee has to obey to orders and instructions of the employer. So this legal subordination, the possibility of the employer give the directions, exact directions of how the work is done, is what characterizes the labor agreement. So this is completely maintained on this new legislation, and of course the concept of the labor agreement is maintained. So the idea is every time you are a cultural professional and you work under these circumstances, you have to have a labor agreement with all the consequences of most of the consequences of the general law plus the ones in the status. We also have a legal presumption, which is rebuttable. I mean, it admits contrary proof for the presumption, which says that if, I don't know if here there's something like this, Martina, no, there is something like this, a legal presumption for a labor agreement. No. Okay, so according to the Portuguese law, if you have a fixed workplace, a fixed schedule, if you work with your employer instruments, if you have a direction job, and if you have a period and a certain salary, the court can decide that you are an employee and you have a labor or should have a labor agreement. But of course, it is rebuttable if you can prove the autonomy of the worker. And the legal status was really high on trying to force to accomplish, and you will see we have a practical measure to do that, to really accomplish, to make the sector really accomplish with making labor agreements in order to cultural professions have the social protection they need. And in the status, you can make a lot of labor agreements. The normal open-ended employment agreement, when you are hired and, well, if something happened, you are fired or if you want to leave, but you will start today and you will stay employee of that employer. A fixed-term temporary contract, so a short contract. And we also have an unfixed term. Okay, so or I do when it ends, or I know it will end, but I don't know when. And then I have a very short-term contract, which makes available for the sector to make a one-day labor agreement contract, if needed, which was not possible before the status. This very short-term contract was already in law, but not available for the cultural sector, only for other individual identified sectors. We have an intermittent contract, which is not the intermittent that is already known in Europe and, for example, that started in France. It's when, for example, in an orchestra, we have a lot of musicians, but I don't need them all the time. So when I don't need them, I can put him home and load their salary. It's not a very good idea. But anyway, in the negotiations with the sector, they passed this, so it must be something on trade-off. And we have another kind of contract which are several employers, which has the advantage for the artist that in case of co-productions, it happens a lot on the performing arts. If we have a co-production, I can be an employee for all of them. Of course, there is one that is my interlocutor, but then the only advantage is that if no one pays me, I can ask for the payment to all of them. So it's a guarantee. Some special rules. Because on the labor law, the exclusivity, it's a kind of a rule on the labor agreement. In the sector field, it's an exception. To be an employee in the cultural sector with exclusivity, the employer have to pay you a fee. It's not on the law, how much is this fee, but it's on negotiation conditions that you define this, but some amount has to be paid to the cultural professional to have the exclusivity. We also have a rule that safeguard the technical and artistic autonomy. So it says, although you have to obey, although you have that legal subordination, the employer must know that artistically and technically you are autonomous. And we have some different rules for what is considered work schedule. not only when you are working exactly on your job description or an actor, but if you are giving an interview, or if you are doing a research by your own, all of that is considering work schedule, time of work. And also the workplace is not only where exactly the employer says you have to work, but if you want to do research or if you want to go and get inspired on the landscape, you can go wherever you want. But if you have an accident, for example, it's considered workplace, so the insurers should be responding. Service agreement or the freelancer situation. So as for the labor agreement, you should be you should have this legal subordination if you are really autonomous on doing your work, so you can be hired as a freelancer and you can have a service agreement. Special service agreement rules. It was established a rule which says that the hiring entity have to pay until the maximum, until the end of the month after the service is completed. Because it was like, oh, well, okay, I completed the service, but when I'm going to be paid? When I am going to be paid? And the legislators he felt this need to make this provision. It's also there is also mandatory to every time a freelance ends their service, the hiring entity has to issue a certificate of their activity, because to the registration it may be needed to prove that you worked by the time doing that job description for that entity for the X project. And the practical measure there was telling you that goes with the idea that the cultural sector must be as much as the employee as the others, is that every time you hire a freelancer, you have to fill a form online on the site of the General Inspection for Cultural Activities, which is an institution depending on the Ministry of Culture, identifying the contract and saying why is that fundaments the idea and justifies the idea that is not an employee, that he should not have a labor agreement. So every freelancer you hire on the cultural field, you have to do this form and do this justification. Of course, it's a lot of questions of yes and no, and free space to add additional information if you want, but you do have to do this form. And the idea is to get a random fiscalization when the answers are not that good. Okay. And now the social protection, the bright part of the status. So what is new now? There are new protection fields for freelancers. They were not eligible for those some of those new protection fields. It was created this allowance, this subsidy for suspension of cultural activity, which is the most important part of the status in the social protection field, and it's that unemployment allowance for the freelancers on the sector. Already existed subsidy for professional reconversion, but it was a little bit modernized. But as long as we know, nobody asked for this. We don't know, but as we know, nobody asked. And new taxes to fund these subsidies. So new protection for freelancers: illness, parenthood, occupational disease, disability, old age, and death. This is going to be it has to be issued more regulation after. New taxes don't have to be really, I mean, knowing this by heart, okay? I'm not going to ask you this, how much is the tax on the questions, but it is a little bit higher for the freelancers on the service contracts, a little bit higher. If you are not in the status, if you're not registered, it will be 21.4. And now it will be 25.2 if you want to be in the status and if you want to be eligible for the subsidy. And the hiring entities, they all have to pay, whether you are registered or not, this 5.1 over 70% of the fee of the freelancer. Why is that hiring entities have always to pay whether you are registered or not is because if it was not like this, only non-registered professions will be hired because they will save this money. So that's why both, if you are registered or not, have to be, the hiring entities have to pay. So these taxes are only due after 1st October 2022. And these are derived for very short-term contract because if you have very short, if you have a very short-term contract, you will not be eligible for the normal and general unemployment allowance. You will be eligible for this as a freelancer for the very short, for as I told you, the 1 day or 2 days. This very short contract can be done until 70 days per year. So how can the freelancer be eligible for this subsidy for suspension of cultural activities? You have to be fiscal resident in Portugal. You don't have to be Portuguese, but you have to be a fiscal resident in Portugal. You have to be registered on that registration, on REPAC. You have to complete a qualifying period of 180 days. I'm going to explain you how they get this number. It's not exactly as in France, for example, as to the intermittence du spectacle, they count in hours. We have another formula. And the unemployment or the non-work period should be involuntary. And for that, we consider involuntary after, sorry, because if I can go that way. Actually, I see better, so it's better for me too. It's considered involuntary unemployment if you are 1 month without invoicing, without work. Okay, other rules of this subsidy. It's granted only once a year, civil year, from 1st January to 21st of December. The amount of the subsidy is 65% of the median income. With this formula, they pick up the income, they divide on 12, on 30, 60, and then it's 65 over the result of these divisions. It can be from 90 days to 360, although the 360 days are like a subsidy that is almost a pre-retirement grant. So it's only for people over a certain age and with a lot of days of contribution. So, and how we find I say they because it's the Social Security who do this. How can we find this qualifying period? So we pick up the income of the freelancer, then we apply this formula, which is a Portuguese official index for social support, this IAS, 2.5 AISs are 1,108 euros, and they divide it for 3, which is 30, which is 30 days like a month, and they find a value a day for 2022, which is 36.93. And then they divide your income for this daily value, and they see how many days you have already contributed. And by then, they see if you have under 180 or more than 180, and they find if you are eligible or not to the subsidy for the suspension of the cultural activity. So the minimum income, considering this 2022 amount, that freelance have to. This income, it's the total amount of the fee. It's not the 70% over which the tax is applicable. No, it's the gross income, okay? So the minimum you have to had already invoiced to have access to the subsidy is 6,647 euros and 40 cents. This consideration of the income started in 1st of July. So every invoice that the freelancer issued after 1st of July is already counting to this amount. But the taxes and the payment of the subsidy will only start in October. And that's it. Less than 20 minutes. Again, thank you very much.
Tak jo.
Okay.
Máme tak neuvěřitelné množství času, že
we have plenty of time, so we actually do have enough time to ask questions. So if you already have questions to any of our presenters, please come up with them. We have a microphone, so if you want to ask questions, please speak to the microphone. And I'm sorry, this is my phone ringing. It's the alarm for this presentation, which already ended. So I know maybe you're a little bit surprised, but don't hesitate and ask questions. If you don't have any, there will be a break and you can think of your questions for the next part.
Yes?
And meanwhile, thumbs up for our presenters. You are fantastic.
Information that I didn't include because I was afraid of the time, but that is always funded, this subsidy, always funded. How the state got the money to pay the subsidy. So it's part of these contributions that you saw there and part of the penalties and Social Security has a lot of resources, but there are special resources dedicated exclusively to this fund, and it's part of these contributions. All the penalties that are applicable to the professionals and the entities not accomplishing the status. So every penalty which comes from the not accomplishing the status is for the Social Security, and a part of the general contribution of the employees that are cultural professionals. That's the way we fund the subsidy. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for this. Já jsem jenom zvědavý, kdy my se dobereme k té situaci, že už budeme řešit.
I wonder.
Well, good afternoon.
Dobré odpoledne. Doufám, že jste si užili obědovou pauzu a že máte dost energie na odpolední část. Skutečně moc hezké místo, díky za pozvání na tuto zajímavou konferenci. V těch 20 minutách teď budu mluvit o procesu, který jsme zahájili na podzim 2020, který se týká férového odměňování. Proč? Férové odměňování je podle mě bez pochyb nejdůležitější téma v odvětví umění. A za druhé, mít nějakou strategii férového odměňování se nám v Rakousku podařilo. Máme to v programu ještě od dob před pandemií, takže ta pandemie vlastně přišla ve vhodnou dobu, kdy už jsme to stanovené měli. Do toho programu se zapojil jak federální úřady, tak regionální úřady. A abychom to zajistili, tak jsme stanovili 2 komise. Tou první byla pracovní komise Fairness, zastupující regionální a federální úroveň. Proč jsme to tak udělali? Ono totiž financování má především na starost regionální úroveň u nás v Rakousku, takže bylo důležité se shodnout na stejné strategii, abychom mohli poskytnout dostatek peněz pro férové odměňování. A pak jsme založili takzvané fórum Fairness, kam jsme přizvali hlavní zúčastněné strany a aktéry z umění a kultury, zejména a pouze z nezávislých sektorů. Ještě než jsme se začali o tom samotném tématu bavit, tak jsme se museli nejprve připravit, abychom vlastně vytvořili takovou férovou platformu, férové prostředí, ve kterém se můžeme o férovém odměňování vůbec bavit. Takže jsme se například zabývali tím, jestli je v pořádku stanovovat minimální sazby, jestli to není v rozporu s unijním právem. A za tímto účelem jsme si objednali na Vídeňské univerzitě studii, která nám potvrdila, že ano, minimální sazby jsou v rozporu s unijním právem o hospodářské soutěži. A je to kvůli tomu, že ty minimální honoráře totiž se nediskutují mezi zaměstnanci a zaměstnavateli. A že v tom volném sektoru nebo freelancovském sektoru to nefunguje jako při jednání s odbory. Takže my jsme věděli, že chceme minimální honoráře stanovit, ale že je vlastně nemůžeme doporučovat, protože by to bylo v rozporu s tím unijním právem. Loni jsme také zorganizovali sympózium. Výsledky z toho najdete online. Pozvali jsme tam zajímavé speakery z celé Evropy, kteří mluvili o tom, jak to funguje v jejich zemích. Naší hlavní hostkou byla zástupkyně Evropské komise, která mluvila o tom projektu skupin OMC, kterou tady zastupuje Slovensko. Říká jsem Portugalsko, ale ne, ale Slovensko. Myslím, že se budete setkávat příští víkend ve Vídni, je to tak? Moc si cením vaší práce, díky za to, to je skvělá skupina. Na tom sympóziu jsme se bavili například o kodexu férovosti, který jsme založili pro náš sektor. Rovněž jsme se bavili o založení úřadu důvěry. Ten začal fungovat před 2 týdny ve Vídni, to je také velmi důležité téma. Jakmile máte jako umělci problémy s nějakým zneužíváním ze strany lidí, kteří mají moc, tak se můžete obrátit na tento úřad a podat stížnost, a to i anonymně. Takže toto bylo také součástí těch našich příprav na férové odměňování. Pak jsme stanovili ten kodex férovosti, inspirovali jsme se v Nizozemsku, kde to funguje skvěle. Tam před pár lety přišli s takovým kodexem, je to nezávazný dokument, který můžete zveřejnit na svých webových stránkách a v podstatě tam jenom deklarujete hodnoty vzájemné důvěry a respektu. Jako instituce v kultuře to uděláte a v ten moment se vlastně zavazujete k určitým hodnotám. Není to právně závazné, ale je to samozřejmě velký krok. My jsme to v Rakousku zavedli na jaře letošního roku a na webovkách si to zveřejnila už řada rakouských institucí. Po těchto přípravných krocích, které nám zabrali zhruba 1,5 roku, jsme pak založili fokusní skupinu na férové odměňování. To bylo dost složité. Když diskutujete o férovém odměňování, tak na to potřebujete peníze. Nám ale se podařilo získat 6,5 milionů eur na letošní rok, abychom přišli s opatřeními pro férové odměňování. Když tedy máte peníze, tak se musíte zamyslet nad tím, jaká kritéria budete uplatňovat na to, abyste tu férovost zvýšili. Abyste ty peníze tedy využili správně a aby se ty peníze dostaly k potřebným věcem. Opět jsme spolupracovali s zúčastněnými stranami. Bez toho to nejde. Je to skutečně klíčové. Bez spolupráce s dalšími aktéry z toho odvětví nemůžete vytvořit férovost. Takže jsme s nimi konzultovali skutečně čile a vše v úzké spolupráci s nimi. Tu první fázi jsme zahájili na začátku letošního roku a abychom se ujistili, že ty peníze využijeme správně, tak jsme začali počítat. A vypočítali jsme vlastně ten rozdíl v odměňování. Byl tam ještě jeden důležitý přípravný krok. Na začátku loňského roku jsme zadali studii, aby nám identifikovali, jaká je tedy ta mezera, kolik přesně je ten peněžní rozdíl mezi tím, co je fair a co není fair. Výsledky té studie jsme obdrželi v lednu na začátku letošního roku a ukázalo se, že ten rozdíl je asi
asi 21% osobních nákladů na zaměstnance v každé instituci. To jsme tedy spočítali. Je to těch 21%, to je ten rozdíl, ale zároveň jsme zjistili, že nezávislý kulturní sektor v Rakousku má asi 100 milionů eur, takže se jedná o dost velké peníze, když přijde na ten rozdíl. Pokud chcete mít přístup k tomu našemu programu, tak musíte pro každý projekt vyplnit takový specifický formulář. Do toho grantu, do těch pomocí jsme zahrnuli několik kategorií, různých kategorií pomoci. V tom formuláři je například potřeba prohlásit, že tu naší dávku na to férové odměňování investujete skutečně na snížení toho rozdílu. Nemůžete z toho zaplatit třeba nějaké produkční náklady. Ne, musí to jít na platy. Pak také musíte se zavázat, že ty jednotlivé peníze půjdou na srovnání těch rozdílů, to jsem již říkala. Pak musíte také se ujistit, že veškeré ty peníze půjdou na srovnání toho rozdílu, takže musíte zjistit nejprve, kde je ten rozdíl největší, kdo má nejméně v porovnání s ostatními a tomu ty peníze dát. Následně se tyto peníze mohou použít pouze již na existující pracovní pozice. Tohle nám přijde smysluplné, protože jsme to celé vypočítávali již na základě existujících pracovních pozic. Takže pro letošek ta dávka může směřovat pouze již k lidem, kteří byli již zaměstnaní na těch daných pozicích předtím. V dalších fázích ale od letošního podzimu a příští rok tohle vynecháme. Nechceme se omezovat pouze na existující pozice. Nechceme být příliš přísní. Naše odvětví potřebuje podporovat i ostatní pozice a potřebuje zvýšit počet pracovních pozic. Do té dávky nespadnou všichni. Nevztahují se například na grantové organizace, na organizace, které vlastní úřady, příspěvkové organizace, například státní opery nebo instituce, které mají již založené kolektivní smlouvy. Pokud máte kolektivní smlouvy, tak byste měli mít férové odměňování nastavené v té dané instituci. A pokud jsou ty smlouvy dobře nastavené, tak by tam neměl být rozdíl v odměňování. Pojďme na další slide. Letos v červnu jsme dosáhli velkého milníku. Od začátku toho procesu jsme se ujišťovali, že budeme brát v potaz všechny názory. My jsme sice malá země, ale těch názorů tam byl bezpočet. Takže jsme se snažili přijít k nějakému společnému stanovisku napříč regiony na té federální úrovni. Myslím, že 2 až 4krát jsme se sešli nad takovým nezávazným dokumentem, takovou deklarací, kde jsme velmi přesně a jasně stanovovali, jak ta strategie bude v těch následujících letech fungovat. Ten dokument jsme dali dohromady, všechno jsme zveřejnili na našich webovkách, takže to tam můžete najít. Většina z toho je samozřejmě v němčině, ale máme i nějaké anglické dokumenty. Vytvořili jsme tedy tuto strategii ve spolupráci se všemi 9 federálními státy a píšeme tam, že každý ten stát si bude ta jednotlivá opatření stanovovat v rámci své vlastní pravomoci. Jak jsem říkala, my jsme získali z té federální vlády víc než 6 milionů, což je navýšení asi o 12% ve srovnání s předpandemickou dobou, takže to je ohromný nárůst financování. Několik regionů ale mělo pocit, že tím na ně vyvíjíme nátlak, že ten pokrok je velmi rychlý, že vlastně jim dáváme hodně peněz nás a vyvíjíme na ně tlak. Ale my nechceme samozřejmě tlak jakýkoliv vyvíjet. Chceme, aby regiony se cítily dobře a aby v tom celém procesu cítili důvěru a respekt. A proto jsme tam stanovili tuto klauzuli, že je na každém státu, aby si s těmi jednotlivými opatřeními přišli podle svého, ale musí samozřejmě s nimi přijít včas a neotálet příliš a začít ty peníze používat. Rovněž jsme uvedli, že každý stát je zodpovědný pouze za uplatnění svého podílu těch peněz, které dostane. Jak jsem říkala, ten rozdíl v tom odměňování je asi 21%, ale to se liší napříč různými projekty. A navíc každý projekt financují různé regiony. Respektujeme to, že některé instituce dostávají peníze jak od regionu, tak od státu, že to je různé. Respektujeme ty statistiky, ta procenta a na základě toho rozdáváme ty peníze. Máme tedy téměř 7 milionů k dispozici a doufáme, že se nám podobné peníze podaří obdržet i příští rok. Doufáme, že to bude ještě trochu víc. V plánu tedy po roce 2023 máme o férovém odměňování už jen nemluvit. Protože všechny studie ukazují, že férové odměňování je nové opatření a nikdo by nedokázal, nikdo by neměl se tomuto přístupu vyhýbat. Všichni by měli přistupovat k férovému odměňování jako k něčemu, co je základem. Proto od příštího roku všechny organizace, které s námi již spolupracovaly letos, nebudou muset vyplňovat třeba ty složité formuláře. Data od těchto organizací již máme, takže by měla být správná. V létě jsme udělali další důležitou věc. Setkali jsme se s aktéry několikrát a přizpůsobili jsme ty naše výpočetní formulky tomu, jaká je reálná situace, abychom zlepšili ten výpočetní systém. A opět zase očekáváme, že férové odměňování bude něco zcela přirozeného, že se to bude respektovat a že to všichni budou dodržovat. A to bez výhrad na všech úrovních. Samozřejmě bude to chvíli trvat. Regiony musí si opatřit peníze na to, aby férové odměňování mohly zafinancovat. Ale to je náš cíl. A nepochybujeme o tom, že díky tomuto opatření se nám podaří dosáhnout větší rovnosti v celém sektoru. Pro příští rok jinak ta opatření jsou docela podobná jako letos. Je tam jeden ale velký rozdíl a to je to, že budeme mnohem přísnější. Budeme mít mnohem přísnější audity. Máme separátní auditní oddělení a velmi úzce budeme zkoumat každý projekt, který požádá o tu dávku. Takže bude potřeba ta kritéria splňovat do puntíku. To je velmi důležité, protože často se děje to, že umělci, nezávislí umělci chtějí pracovat, chtějí na pódium, chtějí před publikum, což je pochopitelné. A někdy by měli tendenci použít tuto dávku za jinými účely. Ne kvůli tomu, aby vyrovnali odměňování, ale aby podpořili jiné rozpočtové položky. toho daného projektu. Ale tomu my se chceme vyhnout a chceme přísně respektovat skutečně ta pravidla, jednak ze strany poskytovatelů peněz, ale i ze strany těch příjemců. Protože my prostě nechceme, aby umělci nebyli odměňováni férově. Buďme fér, potřebujeme být my v ten moment fér a umělci taky musí být fér a musí respektovat svá vlastní práva. Další slide je už můj poslední slide. Tady vám prostě říkám děkuji za pozornost a nashledanou.
A UBI, an unconditional basic income for artists, which is what has happened in Ireland. The 12th of May 2022 was the closing date for applications for a unique research-based unconditional income program for 2,000 artists and creative art professionals who will receive €235 per week for 3 years. More will be explained by the principal officer in culture, Sharon Berry, who is probably here with us right now. Can you hear us?
I can, yeah. Hi.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much for being with us. And I think that the main question at the very beginning is if you could give us a brief introduction to this pilot program, what it is, and most importantly, why.
Okay, well, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, that's good. And thanks for having me. So I suppose Ireland's basic income pilot scheme is really, the purpose is to examine the impact of a basic income style payment on artists and on their creative practice. So participants will be paid €325 per week for 3 years, and there'll be 2,000 people on receiving the payment. We'll also have 1,000 people in a control group who were eligible but weren't selected for the pilot, and they'll be paid €650 a year to compensate them for engaging in the same data collection as those receiving the basic income. And I think it's important to have a control group because we need to be able to compare and contrast outcomes against those in receipt of the payment and those who didn't receive it. In terms of what the objectives are, I mean, the primary aim is to address income stability, or rather income instability in the arts sector. I think it's very well established that artists suffer from precarious incomes, and the scheme will look at the impact on an artist's creative practice of providing a basic income and that security of income over 3 years. There's a number of supplementary aims that we have, which would include just giving recognition to the intrinsic value of the arts, and also to recognise the value of the time people spend on creative practice, which is often low paid or unpaid. We want to be able to enable artists to focus on their creative practice without having to enter into other economic sectors in order to sustain themselves. You often find that artists, hold down multiple jobs in other sectors just in order to survive. We're also hoping to provide income during periods when people are developing and just emerging, so when their practice and portfolio is being developed, and to try and minimise the loss of skills and experience from the arts sector, particularly in the post-pandemic environment. I suppose to the specifics of the scheme, it's a 3-year research pilot really, and the ultimate ambition is to provide an evidence base to underpin future arts policy and how we go about funding artists and arts practice in Ireland. The main element of that research programme is going to be a longitudinal study, so we'll be deploying the same survey every 6 months for 3 years. It's a very comprehensive survey, which will require relatively significant commitment on the part of the participants. We'll be collecting data across a very wide variety of research domains, so we can measure the impact of the payment on themes such as income, time use, creative output, changes in employment pattern, and also mental health and well-being would be very key themes for us to measure. We'll be comparing the results of those 6 monthly surveys back against an initial baselining survey that will happen before the first payment takes place. So we'll baseline all the participants as to where their careers and incomes are at before they start receiving the payment. And again, all of this data is going to be open source and available to anybody who's interested in doing their own research on this topic.
Sharon, so if we understand it correctly, it's a give-and-take thing. So you give something, but you also would require at least the survey part to be there. Is that correct? Anything else?
Yeah.
And anything else for the evaluation?
We will be doing art form specific research, focus groups, interviews with participants. We'll be looking at different themes. I mean, we haven't decided finally the entire research program, but we will want to look at art form specific challenges, because obviously there's different challenges if you're in film to theatre to visual practice, or visual arts rather. So we'll be doing a lot of different types of dedicated art form specific research as well. But what we won't be, while we'll ask people to tell us the impact on their creativity, on the amount of time they spend on their creative practice and on their outputs, there won't be a qualitative assessment. We're not going to be judging the quality of their output, just how the payment impacted them as an artist, how it supported them in spending time on creative practice, and the overall impact on their creativity.
May 12 was the deadline for the applications. We just probably would like to know how many artists applied, and if somehow the selection was corrected during the process and also during the contracting.
Yeah, so it closed for applications on the 12th of May, and we had just over 9,000 applications. So there's a lot of interest in it. We have 2,000 places on the scheme, so it was fairly significantly oversubscribed. We spent the summer assessing those applications for eligibility, and just over 8,200 of them were considered eligible. So all the eligible applications were included in an anonymised, randomised selection, so essentially a lottery, because, again, we didn't want to do a qualitative assessment, because we're trying to support artists and practice across all stages of career. So from people who've just maybe recently trained to emerging, developing artists, to people with much more established careers. So in terms of how they demonstrated their eligibility, they had to provide 2 proofs to us that they had an active creative artistic practice. And there are 3 ways, there are kind of 3 categories of evidence. So one would have been proof of income from the arts. So that could be a commission, a grant from a recognised arts organisation. The second proof was evidence of having a creative practice, an active practice. So that could be, having recent work published, having taken part in an artist residency, having writing credits, performing work, evidence of activity, I suppose, in your creative practice. And then the third was if you were a professional member of a relevant recognised representative body, so such as Visual Artists Ireland, Dance Ireland, the Screenwriters Guilds. There was 10 or 12 organisations. So if you could provide 2 evidence of a recent creative practice, then you were eligible to be included in the selection. We also had a separate stream, smaller stream, 200 included in the 2,000. We'd set aside 200 up to 200 places for recently trained, so people who've recently graduated. And again, that was to try and examine every stage of an artist's career from really just recently out of college or training to a very established career, and to help us kind of determine, I suppose, how effective basic income might be at all career stages for an artist.
So Sharon, just coming back to what you just said, you had a part that was also for the young upcoming artists, but also for the older artists, so before retirement, obviously, but for the artists within the whole spectrum of their artistic career.
Yeah, the entire spectrum. So and in fact, I suppose the assessments finished, and we actually did the selection process a couple of weeks ago, and we've just informed people in the last 2 weeks, offered them their places on the scheme, and every demographic is covered, is represented in that sample. Every age group, we didn't, lots of artists work past what would be a typical retirement age, so we put no upper age limit on this, and we have some people in their 70s who will be participating in it. So there is no demographic kind of constraints like that. As long as you could prove that you had an active creative practice, then you were eligible to be included.
Did you somehow incorporated the whole process or the whole research into the National Recovery Plan?
Yeah, so I suppose, if we go back to how the scheme came about in the first place, it was the number one recommendation of an arts and recovery a task force that the Minister for Culture, Catherine Martin, set up in 2020. And that task force was asked to look at ways to help the arts sector recover post-pandemic. And their number one recommendation was to pilot a basic income. So the Minister established an oversight group, which had government departments, the Arts Council, Screen Ireland and other representative organisations on it to look at how to implement those recommendations and specifically what kind of model you might use for a basic income. And that group conducted an international literature review, looked at other examples around the world and proposed a model, the current model that we have, to the Minister. And the Minister, that was really her number one priority in Budget 2022. So she took that report to the government and secured agreement to include it in the National Recovery Plan. But I think, the purpose of it being in the recovery plan is that it's a research programme and it's very much to conduct research and deliver that evidence base and show what the impact and the outcomes might be of providing a basic income. And that's why the data collection is going to be so important over the next 3 years.
Sharon, the obvious question is how the whole research was accepted by the artistic community in Ireland, because, as you said, you had 8,000 applications that were eligible, but only 2,000 places, and also some of the participants to be part of the control mechanism. But how was the whole response on the research?
I think we've had a very positive response, maybe more positive than we would have expected, given that there are obviously 7,000 disappointed people who were eligible but didn't get a place on the scheme. But from the very outset, all through last year, we engaged in very intensive stakeholder engagement. So, we had a stakeholder forum. We met all of the representative bodies and artists to hear their lived experience and to explain to them that this was very much a pilot scheme, the intention being to prove that a basic income would work in the sector, with the ambition to roll out something more permanent in the future, subject to government agreement. And I think, artists are well used to doing research. They understand, they very clearly understood that if they engaged with this and if they worked with it and they knew that there was going to be a lot of data collection, that it wouldn't be hard to prove that providing that security of income should help creative practice, for people who are so used to precarious income. So even though people were disappointed, I think they see the opportunity that this presents for the sector and they were very willing to engage with that. And I think that stakeholder engagement, and we also did a very broad public consultation where we got thousands of comments and suggestions back on it. We were very open about what we were trying to do and the way that we were going to do it. And I think that helped. So there were no surprises. When it came to announcing the 2,000, everybody understood that, there were going to be, a lot of disappointed people.
And the last question, obviously, you are at the very start of the research, but still, based on what you've experienced already, do you think that, and also it depends on politicians and on the situation in 3 years, but do you think this might be a permanent program?
I think it's too early to say whether it could be a permanent program. We got the funding on the basis that we're going to do 3 years worth of really intensive research to provide that evidence base. But I think if you look at basic incomes around the world, they tend to be deployed in sort of low income sectors. And I think that from our perspective, we would be very strongly of the view that, I'd be very surprised if the data didn't bear out that providing a basic income to people and taking that precarious nature out of their career would allow them to focus on their artistic practice and, develop a self-sustaining creative practice for themselves. I think one of the issues for governments, obviously, is basic incomes are expensive. So that's why that data collection piece is going to be so important, so that we can prove the concept and deliver the evidence base for any future government policy. But it's too early to say what might happen in 3 years' time.
Sharon, thank you very much, and good luck to the whole research program.